To talk more about this is Julian Selitzer. He's a historian and professor at Princeton University, and CNN political commentator David Swerdlick. He's also an editor at the Washington Post, and also with us, constitutional attorney Pate. David, let's start with you. Senator Chuck Schumer invoking President Trump's recent nominee for the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch. Trump's tweet also referring to Judge Robart, referring to him as a so-called judge. He was appointed by the last Republican president, George W. Bush, back in 2003. Doesn't this remind you of Trump's attack on Judge Gonzalo Curiel, the judge that was presiding over the Trump University case, when he questioned his objectivity?
It does, Boris, right. Your viewers will recall that back during the campaign, President Trump implied that Judge Curiel could not do his job and rule fairly in the Trump University fraud case because he was of Mexican descent. That was obviously wrong and was condemned by Democrats and Republicans at the time. The disturbing thing, I think, from that tweet by President Trump this morning is that word so-called. Regardless of whether Judge Robart was appointed by President Bush or President Clinton or Obama or any other president, he is a sitting federal judge. The idea that he is so-called suggests that President Trump is deliberately, sort of, with that tweet at least, undermining his authority as a representative of the federal judiciary.
Julian, going to you now. Before we get into this entire legal mess, what are the chances, likely slim, that the White House might just tweak this executive order? Would that be a way to prevent a legal crisis?
Well, it depends what the tweak is. I think the basic substance of this order in many ways is the problem. So the tweaking will be difficult. Obviously, President Trump made comments about allowing Christians in, which caused concern with the judge. So we'll see if he can actually do that. I don't know if he wants to do that, though. I think there's an element of President Trump who thrives in this kind of a battle. And I think the tweet this morning, which is concerning, suggests that he won't easily back down.
All right, Paige, to you, so many legal questions to ask. Yesterday, we had Harvard Law's Alan Dershowitz on Anderson Cooper, and he made a very interesting point about whether or not the Constitution, in this case, applies to some of the people that fall under this travel ban. I want you to listen to what he said.
The Supreme Court has been very clear that that family in Yemen who was denied a visa has no right to due process. Due process only applies to Americans, either American citizens or green card holders, but there is no due process right to get a visa for anybody abroad. So I think although the judge did a very good job on the uniformity, I don't think he wrote a particularly compelling a decision on why it's likely to succeed on the merits in striking down the entire order. And so I think you're going to have an uphill fight in the Ninth Circuit.
So if the Constitution doesn't apply to these folks that are trying to come to the United States, does that throw a wrench in this process?
It does a little bit. I mean, I agree with half of what Alan Dershowitz said. Procedural due process rights are different for someone who's here in the country or has legal status. Someone with a valid visa, someone who's a legal permanent resident, they're clearly protected by the Constitution, and if you're going to deprive them of the ability to come into this country, you got to follow the process. Now, somebody who does not have a visa, who is not a legal permanent resident, who has no status in this country, they don't have the same constitutional rights. You can turn them away at the border as long as the process is fair. Now, this particular judge in Washington, I would not have expected him to detail in this temporary restraining order all the pluses and minuses about the constitutional arguments. All he's trying to find at this stage is there enough to stop it now? Is there a good chance that the folks in Washington and Minnesota will succeed in their lawsuit? And he said that there was.
Well, the next question is, what happens next? Let's play this out a little bit further and help us understand. So this is likely to go to the Supreme Court.
Eventually, I would say, because we already have two inconsistent decisions. We have a judge, a district court judge in Washington, and then on the other side of the country in Boston saying two different things about this.
Completely opposite decisions.
Completely opposite decisions.
So if this goes to the Supreme Court right now, there's a 4-4 split.
Right.
Let's say that weighs into the legal process and there's a 4-4 split on this decision.
Right.
Typically it goes back to the circuit court.
Right.
But in this case there's two opposing decisions. So
That's
What do we do
exactly
at that point?
Well, we have another step in between the district court and the Supreme Court, and that's the circuit court. You've heard a lot of discussion about the Washington case being taken to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That's our appellate court out on the West Coast. There's another appellate court, in fact, there are many of them, but there's one that covers Massachusetts and states in the Northeast. That's the First Circuit.
Right.
You could have two inconsistent decisions from those courts, and that's when the Supreme Court takes it up. What I expect to happen, though, and it's great to see that some of the executive agencies, despite the rhetoric from the president this morning, have decided to follow this so-called judge's order and stop right now. Give the court in Washington time to wade through these constitutional arguments, issue a final decision on the merits, and then take it up to the Ninth Circuit. Let that play out at the Ninth Circuit. What concerns me, though, is people are thinking, well, it's okay now if I got a visa to get back on a plane. Well, what happens if the Ninth Circuit reverses this decision
Because it's
tomorrow?
not a done deal.
It's
right?
not a done deal. And the Justice Department said we're going to challenge it at the earliest opportunity. Well, that's today. They could file a motion right now.
Right. So just to be clear, the decision is based on the fact that this is likely to prevail, not
Correct.
the fact that it has prevailed.
That's exactly correct, yes.
All right. Paige, thanks so much. We still have a lot more questions to ask. Julian, very quickly to you, we've seen week after week of controversy from President Trump. First the Women's March, last week the travel ban, now the fallout from the travel ban. Is this just the new normal?
Yes, I don't think President Trump is going to change. The question is, when do these other actors start to put restraints on the president? Now we have seen a judge do that. We have seen protests, not just here, but all over the world, starting to build political pressure on the president. And finally, the big question that we need to keep focused on, the Congress. When does the Republican Congress start to buckle in its support of President Trump? Until it does, he still has a lot of sway, and I think he will keep moving forward with these aggressive actions.
Now, Julian, to you, this is really fascinating, in part because Trump is doing something that most politicians don't, and he's doing something that his supporters love to see. He's carrying out his campaign promises. Some 47% of Americans approve of this travel ban. In effect, this is an extension of what he said on the campaign trail. How do Trump voters see this new legal battle? I mean, it has to upset them, right?
Well, I think they'll be more upset with the court rather than him, and my guess is the so-called is a signal to his supporters that he intends to fight. I think you're absolutely right. He is trying to convey a president who does what he says. He is not a president who is scared by anyone, including a judge. And so I think his focus now in the electorate is not on these national polls. It's on that coalition that brought him into office, and he is trying to energize them and keep them excited about who he is and what he's doing.
David,
Boris,
go ahead.
Yeah, can I just add, I agree with Julian. I would just say if you look into the crosstabs of the CNN ORC poll, yes, only 47% of Americans overall favor the Muslim ban, but 87% of self-described Republicans and 92% of Trump supporters support the Muslim ban, and that is who the president, I think, is playing to.
Right. There certainly is Exhibit A for the polarization of our country. Guys, we will see you shortly after a break. Unfortunately, we have to go to commercial during this very heated discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.
Just minutes ago, the Department of Homeland Security is saying that it will not implement President Trump's order banning citizens from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering the U.S. A State Department official also tells CNN it is reversing the cancellation of thousands of provisionally revoked visas. Back with us is our panel, Julian Selitzer, a historian and professor at Princeton University, and CNN political commentator David Swirlick, who's also an editor at the Washington Post, and constitutional attorney Paige Pate. Paige, let's continue with you, getting back into the legality of all of this. Obviously, it's still not a done deal.
Right.
It's based on the likelihood that this is going to prevail. In your eyes, what are the weaknesses here for this to move forward?
Well, for the Washington order, I think there are basically 2 weaknesses. The Attorney General in Washington relied very heavily not so much on the text of the executive order, because nowhere in that order does it actually say Muslim ban.
Right.
What the Attorney General in Washington did, though, is put into his complaint a lot of language that the president had used about banning Muslims, a lot of language about the implementation of the order, not just the text itself. So the Justice Department will likely come in and challenge that basis for suggesting that the order is unconstitutional. It is not unconstitutional on its face, and so that'll be their first argument. I think their second argument will be this judge really doesn't have the jurisdiction to ban this on a national scale. Now, the judge relied on the Texas case, which is where President Obama's immigration executive order
Dream Act
was stayed, exactly. But the administration back then didn't challenge the jurisdiction. They challenged the merits. So I don't know if the Justice Department is going to suggest that this judge doesn't have the ability to do what he did, or if they're going to focus on the merits.
Different routes of attacking, certainly. David, quick question for you. Something we just mentioned. This is kind of a precedent set by Republicans, isn't it? The Democratic method of challenging Trump's executive order is basically filing a lawsuit, something that we saw Republicans do during President Obama's administration.
Yeah, Republicans challenged the Obama administration on any number of issues, from the Affordable Care Act to his executive orders on immigration. And the Trump administration certainly has the right, the White House, the Justice Department, Department of Homeland Security, to now go to the appeals court and challenge the temporary restraining order from from the Washington federal judge. But that is the proper place for this to be litigated along the lines that Page just laid out, not for the White House to sort of undermine the judge's rightfully issued temporary restraining order, but to challenge it, I think, on the merits, because what's at the heart of this, I do think, is whether or not this constitutes a Muslim ban. I would guess that the White House might be willing at some future point to tweak some of the language to clarify which visa holders or or refugees are able to enter or not enter the United States, but they have pushed back strongly on the idea that this is a Muslim ban, even though, in my view, I do think based on the 7 countries that are named in the executive order, you can certainly make a case that it is a Muslim ban.
We have still so many questions to ask. Paige, Julian, and David, thank you so much for the time. Right now,